Hello, everybody. What I'm going to talk today, unsurprisingly, is about my forthcoming book, which is about how to decode the venture mindset. And first of all, let me tell you why I use the word venture mindset. So I've been doing, as Allegri said, research on venture capital for many, many years. And here is one piece of my research that I personally was very impressed when I learned about this myself for the first time. What we did in my team at the Venture Capital Initiative here at the GSB, we took every single company in the US that went public in the last 50 years. And there were thousands and thousands of these companies, okay? And then we checked how those companies that went public and became successful were financed before they were public. And it turns out that every second company that ever became public in the US in the last 50 years or about that was primarily financed by venture capital. Moreover, out of every dollar spent on R&D by these companies that became public in the US, 92 cents spent by the companies that used to be venture-backed. So the venture capital industry is in large part behind all those companies that are now public and well-known. Now, if you look at top companies in the US, and that depends on the gyrations of the day, Tesla might be up or down, but 6, 7, or 8 out of top 10 companies of market capitalization in the US are venture-backed, or were venture-backed when they were small companies. And that is really amazing because the United States is a huge exception. What we did is we compared the US with other countries, every single developed country, really. Just earlier this week on my LinkedIn, I posted a comparison between the US and Germany. So if you happen to be in Germany now, there were no German companies. There are no German companies at all in top 10, indeed in top 20 on market cap that were venture-backed, ever. And 8 out of 10 companies in the top in the US in top 10 were founded in the last 50 years. And only one was founded in the last 50 years in Germany. And the same story repeats again and again. And in another piece of research, I showed causality, which is what we really care about, which is the venture capital industry is causally responsible for the rise of these companies. Had there been no venture capital industry in the US, many of these companies you see on the slide now, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Tesla, likely would not have existed or achieved their scale. So my research shows up to 75% of these large new companies would not have existed had there been no venture capital industry. Indeed, have you ever heard about French Google, Italian Alphabet, Canadian Microsoft, British Apple, Japanese Tesla, and I can continue the list. So that is why venture capital is important. Now, this is the word venture, but there's also the word mindset, which is even more important. What I've learned after studying this for many, many years is that venture capitalists, at least smart of them, make decisions very differently from the rest of us, from the rest of decision makers in economies. And what I also realized by working with a lot of leaders of large companies around the world is that this mindset now should not be confined either to the venture capital industry or to Silicon Valley. That this is very useful, practical, efficient for every single decision maker around the world. So that is really the idea behind the venture mindset. Take the best principles that I studied, that I learned about, that venture capitalists use, make them much more practical, easy to understand, and then apply them thousands of miles outside Silicon Valley, wherever you are, or indeed in Silicon Valley. if you happen to be a founder, an investor, or an executive in a large company. So just last week, I presented about the venture mindset to a number of venture capital firms in Silicon Valley who want to understand how the smartest of their peers make decisions, to large global companies in Silicon Valley. So last week, for example, I presented at Synopsys to executives there. And this is really the rationale behind this book, The Venture Mindset. Now, this is my first non-academic book, and I care about impact. So therefore, the way I wrote it with my former student, Alex Dang, in a very non-academic manner. So think of this as a cross of Agatha Christie and Malcolm Gladwell. So hopefully, as I think every single early readers find out, is like a page turner. So I hope that when you get the book, you will not put it down, and then we'll make sure to get it for all of your friends and colleagues. For the founders here and for the investors, to celebrate the book launch, what I also did is just released last week a 200-page unicorn report. So I've been studying unicorns, how companies, venture-backed companies, become successful, for several years now, by identifying every single US venture-backed unicorn, identify companies that similar to them but did not become unicorns, and comparing them very, very carefully. So you can now download this unicorn report and have a look. So let me go and talk about some of the key principles of the venture mindset. And again, if you have any question, please raise your hand. And Allegra, if there are questions in the chat or if there are hands, then please interrupt me because I might not see those. Okay. So here's the 9 key principles of the venture mindset, and each key principle is a chapter in the book. And behind each principle, we give examples of how venture capitalists use that, of how large, successful venture-minded organizations use that, and how you can use it, okay? So let me go over a couple of those principles today. Let me start with the principle number 1, which is called home runs matter, strikeouts don't. So that is a relatively simple principle to understand if you're in Silicon Valley. It turns out to be a flabbergasting, shocking experience for executives in large organizations outside Silicon Valley. Here are statistics from my research. If you take typical 20 early-stage venture bets, which is investments in early-stage companies, around 15 of them, between 15 and 16, will fail, which means that investors lose money 75% of the time. On 2 to 3 to 4 more investments, you will get returns. You will get maybe $2 per dollar, $3 per dollar, $4 per dollar, which is not a bad return, but VCs think still it's almost like a failure because those returns don't cover the losses that they experience on those 75% of failures. And then statistically, there is 1 out of 20 deals, only 1 out of 20, that is a home run. And my informal definition of a home run for an early stage VC, you will get 100x, which means you will get at least $100 on $1 of your investment. And so the entire business model of the venture capital industry is trying to do whatever they can to increase the odds of those home runs, so that if it's not 1 out of 20, but 1 out of 19, it's actually much, much, much better. And of course, to increase the probability that once you have a home run, your return is larger, not 100x, but 200x. Now, couple of practical remarks right away for the founders here in the audience. The VCs, when they evaluate founders, they use this principle every single day. How? Well, first, they will kind of evaluate whether your startup has a chance to become a home run. If they don't see a possibility of that, that's that. That's the end of the story. They will not pay attention to you at all. Second, it turns out that the size of the fund matters dramatically. If your fund is, let's say, $75 million, or if your fund is $2 billion, you will approach the same startup completely differently. Because the question that the venture capitalists are going to ask in their attempt to find a home run is the following. If everything goes according to the plan and this investment of mine will become a true home run, will I ever be able to return my fund? So for a $75 million fund, will I be able to earn $75 million on one investment? For a $2 billion fund, will I be able to earn $2 billion for one investment? And of course, those two different VCs will answer those questions very differently. So founders find out, first of all, what is the size of the fund? Find also out what are the portfolio companies in the same fund. Because if VCs already have a home run in the existing fund from which they are now continuing to invest, their decision-making turns out to be very different. They are much less risk-loving if they have a home run. They're much more risk-loving if they don't have a home run, which is kind of intuitive. What it means really for founders is that if, let's say, you approach a fund, $75 million fund, that already made $45 million of investments, and there's no home run, and by the way, you can find this out these days. There's no home run. VCs really will invest only and only if they really believe that this startup is very likely to fail. But if it doesn't, they will get not $75 million, but like $150 million fund, return. So they really will increase the risk. Where we see this in venture capitalists. So here's two quick quotes. My friend Alex Rampel, who is a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, says, errors of omission are much bigger than errors of commission. Or Bill Gurley at Benchmark says, if you invest in something that doesn't work, you lose 1x your money. If you use Google, you lose 10,000x your money. What is really important, though, is that this is not the principle that only venture capitalists use. Whenever you look at every single venture-minded organization, they use exactly the same principle. And for this book, Alex and I studied dozens of those organizations. Those are just two examples for you. One is Amazon. So Jeff Bezos says, everything needs to scale, including the size of your failed experiments. And that is true. If you look at Amazon, they experiment a lot. They're trying to find home run. I'll provide an example later on. And they fail a lot. So without failure, without strikeouts, there will be no home runs. Another amazing example that I really like is Netflix. If you ever wondered why Netflix now is worth more than all the Hollywood studios combined, it's because they use the venture-minded principles. In fact, all of them. But one of the users, home runs matter, strikeouts don't. So here's a quote from Reed Hastings. We have to take more risk because we should have a higher cancel rate overall, which is failure rate. And indeed, and this is kind of amazing, if you look at the Netflix returns, project by project, which from their point of view is a show, a movie, whatever, it will be indistinguishable from the venture capital returns. Like whatever metrics I showed you, that 1 out of 20 shows will produce a home run, is in fact amazingly similar to Netflix. Most of Netflix's show you've never heard about, they failed. But those home runs are so huge that they generate all the returns. And so these organizations use the same principles, which is driven by power law. So if you're new to this, then you should remember from your GSB days, I'm sure you took data analysis, statistics or whatever, you should remember normal distribution. Well, the world of venture is not driven by the normal distribution, it's driven by power law. And power law means that the best in class is better than everything else combined. Everything else combined, which is very, very different from normal distribution. My biggest point is that if you happen now to work in industries which are far outside Silicon Valley, far outside tech, your industries are more and more driven by the power law. So I don't have time to go into this, but we've done some research on many industries, and the world of competition changes dramatically. Let me just show you two examples. One, you will know. One, I think you might find surprising if you don't know much about venture. First, Let's start with a surprising one. Starbucks. Did you know that Starbucks was a venture-backed company? Here is something that I find very important to mention. Most people think that venture capital invests in tech. That is not correct. That is not the right way to think about this, okay? The venture capital industry does not invest in tech. The venture capitalists, smart of them, invest in startups that offer a different business model or disrupt a business model in the existing industry. It just so happens that those disruptions of business models and new business models tend to happen in technology industries. Okay, but that is kind of, there's correlation, there's causation, but what is really important to understand is that there are many, many examples, and there are more examples recently. There are many more examples recently in the non-technology industries that are really driven both by venture capitalists and by power law. So Starbucks was a new business model because it was the first coffee chain, and now it has around 40% of all coffee shops in the US. That is an example of the power law. Now, Uber is a maybe more familiar example. In the United States, Uber is player number one, Lyft is player number two, and I'm pretty sure that you will fail the quiz if I ask you, who is the player number three? Okay, you will not know. It's the same in any geography. There will be player number one, player number two, and likely you will not be able to tell me the player number three. Okay, so those are examples of the power law. Okay, so here is, if you happen to work in a large company, this is the way to think. So whenever I present or lead strategic offsites to the leaders of global companies, I think this is the slide that they take away from the point of view of kind of just changing the way they think on how to design their companies, is the pyramid of bets: core, adjacent, and new. So what is this? Core is what runs your business now. This is what generates cash. And this is something where typically you don't allow a lot of innovation. You don't want to change it too much. Adjacent is something that is related to your current business model, to your current products, but where you allow incremental innovation. My favorite example in adjacent is Procter & Gamble. So, you know, when I shave with the Gillette razor, Gillette produces razor every year, okay, and making sure that I'm buying a new razor every year. Do you know that Procter & Gamble, the parent company of Gillette, has more PhDs than Stanford, Harvard, and MIT combined? So it's a lot of innovation, but it's incremental innovation. It is the same business model. It is the same customer. It is the same relationship with the customer. And then up there's a new or disrupt. And that is a small but maybe very important triangle. So this is what, if successful over time, is going to take over everything else. And that is where the completely different decision-making process should be used. So this is where Starbucks came or Uber came and disrupted their industries. So here's a quick example how Amazon does it. In the core, they're doing, of course, a little bit of experimentation that many executives call innovation, but the reality is it is not really innovation. It's called A/B test. Like every single time you go to Amazon in the US or around the world, you are a guinea pig. They make small changes and see whether people are more or less likely to click. In adjacent, Amazon is experimenting a lot. There are dozens of products, maybe hundreds, that are being tested at the same time within the same business model. So here within the same e-commerce platform. But at the same time, there are disruptive forces that Amazon is trying to experiment with and innovate. And this is why Amazon is a venture-minded organization. For example, AWS is a completely different business model. It's a completely different customer from its e-commerce platform. It's a completely different relationship with the customer. And it started as an internal project, and then initially very small, and then scaled very, very fast. And now it generates more revenue than its e-commerce platform. Or Alexa, that also has a different business model, and again, started as an internal project. Now, you've heard about AWS, you've heard about Alexa, you might not have heard about Fire Phone, and the reason is it's a huge failure. So there are a lot of failures in especially disrupt space. Fire Phone became very public. Of course, there are many failures that are private, so we don't really know about them within each venture-minded company. Now, here is something to remember about Amazon, about venture-minded organizations. What happened to the executive vice president of Amazon that was in charge of Fire Phone? So it's a new smartphone competitor to iPhone that failed. It cost Amazon hundreds of millions of dollars. What happened to him? Well, in most other organizations, he would have been fired, punished. In fact, in Amazon, he was promoted and then became in charge of the new disruptive projects. Some of them became amazingly successful. So if you happen to be the leader of a large company or in the C-suite and the board member of a large company, take away this pyramid. Typically at strategic offsites, we'll spend like 1 hour discussing this pyramid, and then we'll provide many more examples of other organizations. The way to think about this, in conclusion, is every single large organization is a portfolio of bets. And some bets are your current bets, some bets are your future bets. And use the venture mindset when you develop your future bets. Here is a specific mechanism that venture capitalists use to identify and learn whether their bets work. And that is called anti-portfolio. So here's an example of a well-known venture firm in the Valley, BVP, Bessemer Venture Partners, that in fact makes their anti-portfolio public. What is anti-portfolio? Very simple. It is the companies or startups that you could have invested, but decided not to invest. Okay? And that's interesting because you learn a lot, especially if you learn that your anti-portfolio is more successful than your portfolio. So I worked recently with a very large venture capital firm, and the very first thing I did is I said, well, let's look at your anti-portfolio. The head of the data we looked, and lo and behold, their anti-portfolio performed better than their portfolio. So I said, you know what, guys, we have a lot to work on. Let's try to understand why your anti-portfolio performs better than your portfolio. Obviously, it's something about your decisions. Let's try to identify exactly, and we succeeded in identifying the exact point that they had to change in order to ensure that, well, they invest more in their most successful anti-portfolio companies. For large organizations, but in fact for anything, yesterday I gave an interview to the Motley Fool, the podcast for stock market investors. And the Ricky, who is leading that podcast, found it really illuminating, because stock investors typically look at the stocks they decided to invest in. But the reality is, if you look at Warren Buffett, then Warren Buffett is keeping anti-portfolio, which is the stocks that he wanted to invest. He did the due diligence on, but then he decided not to invest, because anti-portfolio tells you how successful eventually you were. Okay. If there are any questions, so I see a lot of points in the chat, but mostly about how to find my unicorn reports, etc. So if you go to the vcmindset.com, there will be a special tab on unicorn report. Are there any questions about principle one? Please raise your hand or mention this in the chat. And I will go to principle number 2, which should not be unfamiliar to many, but unless you're my former student or really interested in academic research, I will definitely surprise you at least with one result. The principle is how to get outside of your four walls. First of all, you will never be able to find VCs in their offices more than really once a week. They're typically in their office on Monday. The rest of the week, their offices are completely empty. Why? Because VCs know that the best startups, the best ideas don't come to their office, but they have to find them. And so they spend a lot of time. This is our wonderful GSB, Cooper Cafe. And every single time I go to this Cooper Cafe, I see more VCs talking to our students than in their offices. Because VCs know that they need to find founders, not the other way around. So here's from my research how VCs find the deals. I won't go into detail over all of those, but the point is that there's a huge diversity. VCs know that, you know what, you need to find those deals they can come from anywhere. One very interesting point, very interesting source is what we call academically inbound from management. Inbound from management, as you see, and which has a more non-academic name, cold calls. What is cold calls or cold emails? It's basically when the founder emails the venture capitalist and they don't know the venture capitalist. Typically, when you talk to VCs, they say, don't do it. Like, we ignore cold emails. Well, we decided to check because I knew examples where successful companies successful founders had no clue, did not know anybody, they just emailed VCs responded. We decided to check. With my former student, Will Gornal, we sent 80,000 emails from fake startups. We had a great fun building 50 fake websites, 50 LinkedIn profiles, 50 pitches, 50 blurbs from 200 fake founders, and also we build their profiles. But we send those 80,000 emails to actual venture capital investors. Here's an example of an email. And again, about half a dozen of VC friends who in secret advised us told me not to do it. They just told me, Ilya, this is stupid research because you're going to waste 1 year of your time, money, resources, and there will be no responses. So it will be complete failure. So I think of myself as a venture-minded person, so I'm not afraid of failure. But I was trying to catch a home run. So we did send 80,000 emails. It did take us 2 years to pull it off, okay? And the question is, what was the response rate? And the answer is, let me surprise you, is that, so we sent 80,000 emails about 50 different startups. So the response rate varied from startup to startup. The least popular startup got a response of 8%. Now, by the response, I mean positive response, like, let's meet for coffee, can you send me a pitch deck, here's my partner who would love to meet you, etc. The most popular startup got 15% response rate. Just think about this. So it's between 8 and 15%. And by the way, we found out that more successful VCs, those with larger funds, funds with higher multiples, funds with higher IPO rates of their companies, responded much more frequently and much faster than less successful VCs. So cold calls do matter as well. Okay. There was before I go next, there was one question from Dan Beltrama. What was the specific thing that the VC firm you mentioned fixed in order not to make the anti-portfolio mistakes? Good question. So let me go back for a second. And again, it was a very, very successful venture capital firm in the past. And as a result of that, they raised many funds. They increased the size of their AUM, assets under management. And They increased the number of people working, but they did not really change their decision making. People don't really think about decision making, I think, very often consciously, proactively. What happened was that their anti-portfolio that became unicorns that they missed, they had access to all of them. They, in fact, interviewed all those. So at least one of their partners met all of those to be unicorns. And then all of those deals were killed at the partner meeting. Why? Because they were following effectively the principle where everybody has to agree. And these days, that venture capital firm has too many people that are specialized in different niches. And so it was very easy to find a detractor, somebody who said, this must be a very stupid idea. So they decided not to proceed. So that's how they missed most of the unicorns. And it took just, a day, one day at the strategic offsite, about 6 hours. They coalesced together. They changed the way they they make decisions. And I think now, I don't believe that they're going to miss too many unicorns. And luckily, they caught it on time because they still affirm that they still have access to all those deals. Okay? So that is the answer to Dan's question. Let me go to principle number 3, prepare your mind. Now, this is not my phrase. This is a phrase from a very famous French 19th century scientist, Louis Pasteur, who said in his very famous lecture, in the field of observation, chance only favors the prepared mind. Indeed, working on this book, the Venture Minds book, I actually spent a lot of time learning about scientific discoveries, scientific revolutions. And what I've learned is that almost every single scientific discovery was a chance, was serendipitous. But in every single case, it happened because chance met the prepared scientist. The classical example is Sir Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin. It turns out that the observation that Sir Alexander made is the one that a lot of biochemists of the day made before him. They just were not prepared like him, and therefore they do not connect the dots. And he saw exactly the same what other biochemists saw. They just connected the dots. He just connected the dots because he was prepared. Okay, it was not really there for a random chance. It turns out to be that venture capitalists, successful venture capitalists, are very, very similar. Okay? In fact, the co-founder of Excel Partners, a famous venture capital firm in the Valley, says this explicitly. Persistence, patience, and the philosophy of the prepared mind. In fact, within Excel, they call it the prepared mind. Here is an interesting example that I like. And let me preface this by saying it is not an exceptional example. It's a cool one, but it's not an exception. It's a pattern. Let me take you back to the year when the first iPhone was released. Maybe some of you still remember USB drives, flat disks, whatever, floppy disks. So file sharing was really not possible back then. But the idea was there. In fact, in July 2007, Mashable posted the blog that listed 80 plus file sharing startups. And one VC firm, Sequoia, thought that was very interesting vertical. We would like to make an investment in this vertical. And one of the partners, Samir Gandhi, spent 6 months meeting with every single startup listed on the previous page, I'm sure many other teams. He decided not to invest in any of those, which was a very interesting observation. Why? He was preparing his mind, and he did not think that any of those interesting startup teams that he was making knew more than him. That he really was trying to find somebody who he thought would be the best in executing the idea. And he thought only those who really are better than him in terms of understanding this space would be able to execute. And then one day he met those two guys who didn't have any money, who in fact took a Greyhound bus to come to San Francisco from Boston. And he decided to bring them to their partners, to his partners, Doug Leone and Mike Morris, like within a day. And I think in 2 days, Sequoia made what turned out to be one of the best investments. They invested in Dropbox. And when Dropbox went public, Sequoia made a lot of money. But that is a cool story, but it's a typical story. What I observe again and again and again, that smart VCs really have the prepared mind. All those serendipities where they meet an amazing founder, the founder writes the plan on the napkin, and then the VC in 30 seconds decides to invest. This is all myths. The reality is that VCs are prepared. It might seem to you they invest in 30 seconds. They maybe spent years preparing for this moment. Why it's important? I find that many people inside large organizations, for example, typically are not really prepared. So therefore, when there's something happens, serendipity intervenes. They are not taking this up. Okay. Let me go to yet another principle that I find perhaps one of the single most important venture mindset principles that are useful for large companies. And then I will stop and maybe take questions. And this principle is called double down or quit. Let me step back for a second. And for those who are not familiar with the venture capital world, tell you that startups raise money all the time, again and again. On average, a successful venture capital-backed company is going to raise 6.5 rounds of venture funding. So they are effectively, constantly raising money. So I advise many of my former students who are startup founders, and the founder who is going to raise his or her seed, pre-seed, Series A round, and they breathe the sign of relief. And this moment I tell them, what guys? Congratulations, and by the way, start fundraising your next round now. Okay? Now, if we turn the tables, the venture capitalists have to make this decision again and again, whether to fund the same company. So they invested in the seed round, and then a startup is raising Series A round. So the venture capitalist has to make a decision. Are we going to fund the startup in Series A? And then the startup is going to raise Series B. And so every single time the VC will have to make this decision, double down, so invest more or quit, which is effectively stop fundraising. And if you see the cards in the deck, that is because that's actually very similar to poker. If you're a poker player, you know that you always, every time you have to make a decision, you call, you raise, you fold. Amazingly enough, and this is what I've learned by researching this book. This is not my research. This is research, professional research on poker players, is that the single biggest difference between amateur poker players like me and professional poker players is that professional poker players fold much more frequently. They're not afraid of quitting. Amateur poker players, okay, they already made a move. They already put some chips on the table. They have great difficulty folding because they don't want to lose those chips that are on the table. That is the single biggest problem that poker players face and venture capitalists face, and indeed executives in large organizations face. And that is called escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment, okay? And that is easy to say, like ignore sunk costs, deal with escalation of commitment. It is extremely difficult. Like if I just tell you, if you're a poker player or a venture capitalist or an executive in a large organization, well, you have to take care of your sunk costs, okay? That will be impossible to do. The beauty of this is that venture capitalists came up with specific ways to deal with this. And I believe it's really very useful for every single one of us, okay? First of all, a quick example about how this is done in successful organizations. Let me go back to Amazon. Amazon follows the principle: start small, scale fast. Start small, fail fast, which means that you start small, and when you start small, an example is Prime Now, that in fact my my co-author Alex was launching on behalf of Amazon. You start small, and then you know that most of the time you will fail. You know in advance that it's okay, and therefore it makes it much easier to stop the project. But then, if you succeed, then you scale very, very fast. Okay. Now, what is really called in venture-minded organizations, and please remember this, it's called flexibility over commitment. Flexibility over commitment. And I don't have time to go with this. I'll rather go and tell you how venture capitalists use this. But 3 examples of the industries that can use this beneficially will be pharmaceuticals, Hollywood, and mining. I chose 3 very, very different industries. And indeed, I could choose very, very different industries. I could choose more industries to show you how it works. By the way, Hollywood, I've just been to Hollywood last week on the film set of the new, hopefully, blockbuster that is going to come out next year. So it's not going to compete with my book called Mercy, and it's filmed by, directed by Timur Bekmambetov, and the star there is Chris Pratt. And amazingly enough, both of them read my book. Those are the advanced copies. So I posted Chris Pratt on this photograph with Chris Pratt on my LinkedIn earlier today. We had an amazing conversation for about an hour with Chris Pratt about the venture mindset and how to improve how actors and stars could improve their decision making. Okay, so how venture capitalists, in fact, deal with this problem of sunk cost and escalation of commitment? The critical point is to take the decision out of the decision maker who made the original decision. So that is by far the most critical point. Okay. For example, Lightspeed. So Lightspeed, a very successful venture capital firm. Proud to say, some of my former students are partners at Lightspeed Capital, and Lightspeed formed a special reinvestment team. And reinvestment team's responsibility effectively is, if a partner at Lightspeed makes an initial decision and would like to invest again, then the partner has to come to the reinvestment team. And the reinvestment team acts as an independent arbiter, effectively evaluates and doing the due diligence on the startup that was already a portfolio company. And the reason is to introduce balance and checks and to reduce the escalation of commitment. And you actually can read an interview with Michael Romano, Lightspeed's chief business officer, telling how exactly they implemented this and why they think it's very useful. And I think many venture capital firms now have these sort of reinvestment teams. Okay. Another example is this example of another venture firm, Hammer Wimblund, and I'm showing you Anne Wimblund, a co-founder of Hammer Wimblund. They seek the outsider's perspective. What they do, effectively, they have a condition that if they invest in a startup, they're going to invest again if they can find another reputable, credible venture capital firm that is going to lead the next round. So they kind of don't trust themselves because they know from their own experience is that they tend to become very emotionally attached to the founders that they backed. And in the world of uncertainty, you always can hope for a miracle. They always can think, well, something great will happen and therefore we will persevere. Another 5 million, another 20 million will save us. Well, the answer is, it will not. The answer is, unless you can find somebody who also thinks so, who doesn't have this emotional attachment, who has not experienced those sunk costs, likely it will not be successful. So I think in every single large organization, you can use other departments, independent consultants, as long as they have the right incentives. The incentive should not be with the only goal, well, I would love to be retained by this company again. That's a problem. This is, by the way, one of the most beneficial usages of consultants and non-executive board members, who are on the one hand outsiders, on the other hand they know a lot of information about the company, and so they can pinpoint to the projects that have been going for years, that companies spend millions or hundreds of millions of dollars that are not going anywhere. We should cancel those projects. I worked with a lot of large companies, and I think that is the single biggest challenge that many large companies face, especially those that have to approve budgets for large projects again and again. And this is where they can take on board the venture mindset right away. Okay, in the remaining 10 minutes, let me describe how venture investors make decisions. And this is really interesting. This actually goes back to my answer to Dan's question about those anti-portfolio firm, a venture capital firm. So at the point of when they have to decide whether to invest or not, it turns out that VC firms vary dramatically into how they make decisions. They can make decisions unanimously. So every single partner has to be, an enthusiastic supporter. They can vote, or they have a lot of other ways to make decisions. It turns out that successful venture capital firms don't follow the unanimity rule. And that is a principle in the book. That's the principle of the venture mindset, which is agree to disagree, which I think is one of the most important principles. Agree to disagree. Let me show you Alex Rampell, partner at Andreessen Horowitz once again. He says I like him because he's a quote maker. He loves a lot of quotes, and with his permission, I reuse them. He says, conviction must beat consensus. And I think that's very important, which is a lot of times when you search for consensus in any organization, you will for sure miss an outlier. In order to catch that home run, that jackpot, those home runs are provocative, are controversial, are not obvious. So if everybody agrees, likely that is not a home run. So in fact, if you're the leader in an organization, if you're in charge of group decision-making in the organization, you have to take on board this very simple principle. If everybody is in the room and everybody tends to agree, well, maybe you should meet again, or maybe you should change the decision-making rule, or maybe you should not be making this investment decision or any decision. And many VCs, in fact, try to ensure that they disagree. They try to ensure that different views are heard, that more information is exchanged, and that most importantly, if there are many partners and some partners disagree, they still can proceed with the investment, okay? So here is a very cool story. Again, let me preface this by something that I find important, is that, so of course there are a lot of cool stories. Our book has like about 1,200 cool stories. I'm not really sure how we managed to put all those cool stories in our book, but the reason every single cool story is used is because it's a pattern. It teaches you something. So here's a cool story. Reid Hoffman, a partner at Greylock, found this startup one day, and he came back to his partners and he said, guys, I found this amazing startup that I think we should invest in. And the startup is a very beautiful idea. You can let strangers sleep on a sofa in your living room overnight, and they will pay you, those strangers. And the partners looked at each other in the room and said, this is the stupidest idea we have ever heard in our lifetime. Like, we will never let strangers sleep on the sofa in our living room, okay? Everybody was against. And that would have been the end of the story had Greylock been a large organization, been traditional mindset organization. But they let Reid Hoffman to invest despite the fact that everybody thought it was done. In fact, David Sheck, his partner, said, look, every VC needs to have a deal they can fail on. Airbnb can be yours, right? And so that became, of course, one of the most successful deals for Greylock. Now, here's the point. Here's the pattern, is that in most traditional organizations that seek consensus, you will never catch your Airbnb. There's just no chance of catching Airbnb, okay? Therefore, if you are in charge of the group making in your organization, think very, very carefully. Okay, let me finish by, I know that we're running out of time, so let me finish by, let me skip a couple of things. Let me finish by very specific rules that VCs use. Okay, okay, let me start here. So here's very specific rules that VCs use, smart VCs, to make group decision making more productive. First, small teams. Small teams. If you are around the table and you see more than 12 people, not a good idea, at least for a successful decision making. The average VC firm has 5 partners. The perfect team size, according to a lot of research, is 5 or less. Here's the rule to remember: 2 pizza team rule, which is if you cannot feed your group decision making, your decision making group with 2 pizzas, that's too many people. Okay. So another important point: if you're a leader of the group, write down and find out more about it, or read about it in the book, where we discuss it in great detail. Devil's advocate. Now, devil's advocate sounds politically incorrect, and therefore people use another word like red team. But in fact, devil's advocate has an amazing history. It comes from Roman Catholic Church. So, which is you appoint a person in your group with a charge, with a mandate of finding weak spots. This leads, you actually force people to disagree. And that's important, especially if your organization tends to go towards conformity, towards consensus, towards passiveness in discussions. Devil's advocate is really very powerful tool. Okay. Another one: demand feedback in advance of the meeting. Many VCs demand feedback in advance and make it anonymous, so it's unclear whether the comments was made by the senior partner, the firm maybe is named after the senior partner, or the most junior associate. So demand feedback, demand scoring in advance of the meeting. Okay. And then finally, maybe make sure that in any group, juniors speak first. Funny, I presented this recently to a large Japanese company, and they were on board with this. It was very easy for them because in a Japanese company, you exactly know your rank. Like, I'm number 718 in the company. So juniors should speak first. You just can line up people. The boss should absolutely speak last. I will leave you with a counterintuitive point, provocative. Experts should speak last as well. The reason behind that, experts tend to bias everybody else in the room. So if we think about incremental decision, experts should speak first. If we think about trying to catch a home run, experts have become experts because they're experts about the past. They're not experts about the future. So you don't want experts to bias people in the room. Experts speak fast. Experts speak last. So let me finish by the advertising spiel. I'm actually going to change the label on my door from the David S. Lobel Professor of Private Equity and Professor of Finance. I think I'm going to change it for now to the David S. Lobel Professor of Book Sales. My goal is to become a bestseller, to make more impact, because I would love to launch the venture mindset movement. That is kind of my goal. So if you would like to support Stanford Professor, becoming a bestseller, please order, and please order hardcover copies. That's important because I found out that bestseller lists are extremely venture unminded or unventure minded. They ignore audio versions, they ignore Kindle versions, ebook versions. Only hardcover matters. Okay, let me stop now. Is there any questions?
We actually have one that Mustafa sent earlier, but Mustafa had asked for angel investors who may not necessarily be professional full-time VCs. What are some ways to keep a prepared mind?
That is a great question. Thank you, Mustafa. First of all, I think angel investors should really benefit from the venture mindset. In fact, I already gave a number of webinars. I'm going to give more webinars just to the angel associations, because I believe that they actually can benefit even more than venture capitalists, because venture capitalists professionally, they're interested in improving their decision making. Angels typically don't have really time to think about this. Okay, prepared mind, very simple. Here's a very practical piece of advice if you're an angel. You have the niche that you're interested in. Go on Crunchbase, it's free, or AngelList, it's almost free, or PitchBook, it's not free, and find out every single company in the pre-seed to Series A, don't go to Series B, pre-seed to Series A, that either raised money recently or is trying to raise money now. And if they raise money recently, go and check every single lead investor. On Crunchbase, there's a lot of information about this. And within that lead investor, go to the webpage of the lead investor, the website or whatever, and find out other companies they invested. So this way you will know the exact list of all the companies more or less available these days in your niche. Sometimes you will find companies then you do not think when you niche, because in the new spaces, the naming of the space is different. But yet you find out, wow, that's actually a very similar company to whatever I was interested in. Second, this is the advice I give to my students all the time. Identify those companies, try to identify what is the pain point they are trying to solve. That's very important. What is the pain point? And then try to identify their business model. Now, angels who are not students will have difficulty doing this, but some of them can. So for students, I will say, you know what, just call the startup and say, look, I'm a Stanford student. I would like to learn more about your business model. And I think success rate is like 60% response rate. If you're an angel, also feel free to call and you say, look, I'm an investor in this space. Would you mind spending half an hour? And prepare your questions. And the questions will be not about fundraising, but think about the specific points, and the specific points are about business model and the pain points. Okay?
Yes, we have one from Alex earlier, that these ideas make perfect sense for investing and when you're at a larger company looking for what's next. Both have resources in the form of people and capital. But how might this apply to an entrepreneur with a tiny or no team and very limited capital?
This is a great question, because I believe that founders should have the venture mindset. First, founders, entrepreneurs who would like to raise capital from angels or from venture capitalists need to know how they make decisions, how those investors make decisions. In fact, and my students will confirm, the class that we teach now with Brian Jacobs, the GSB F385, the venture capital class, it's in fact mostly for entrepreneurs. So most students who take it, who would love to take it, either would love to become or really become, excuse me, entrepreneurs, founders. But we really teach this class from the position of venture capitalists, how venture capitalists make decisions. Because I think this way you will become much better entrepreneur. So that's number one. Number two is that, a number of principles in the venture mindset can be applied directly. Not every single one. Double down or quit. This is the critical principle for every single entrepreneur, especially if you have a small team and especially if you have no resources. By the way, let me tell you my personal experience, okay? So when I came to Stanford, by the way, I've been at Stanford for 20 years. On the 1st of July, I will post a huge LinkedIn post about my 20 years at Stanford. So in 20 years, in the first 10 years, before I realized this venture mindset principles myself, do you know my single biggest mistake was? Because, young professors are entrepreneurs in their way. They have small resources, small budgets, no teams, and they have to discover something new. My biggest challenge was, and I think that is the challenge of every single scientist, is double down or quit. Escalation of commitment. I would start a lot of projects. I'm very creative. I'm very excited about this project. I'm very passionate. I maybe attract some PhD students to follow me. 6 months down the road, the project is going nowhere. And I will think, well, I already spent so much time thinking about this project. I already committed to this PhD student. So I need to continue. And I would continue for another 6 months. And that's a horrible mistake. And I think that is the principle I took on board. And I actually think one of the results why I'm, for most scientists, they're more successful in the first part of their career. And then they leave off kind of whatever they earned in the first half. I actually think that I'm more excited about my research career now than I was 20 years ago. One of the reasons is because I think I became much more effective at, for the lack of a better word, killing projects. And by the way, if I'm doing this with students about whom I care, I actually think it's better for them in the long term. It's going to be a short-term shock that I recently had this conversation with a PhD student. I said, look, I think we should change this project. We should pivot it. I know that you spent 4 months doing nothing else, but the challenge is that if you spend 4 months more, I don't think there will be a result, and you will lose 4 more months of your PhD. So maybe it's time to pivot now, okay? And I think it's better for them as well. But in the first 10 years, I did not do it. And in fact, I now use my venture mindset principles, and I talk to a lot of junior colleagues of mine who are, again, I believe they're entrepreneurs in the academia. And I try to convince them on my own example, this is how they should. I can't advise many of them on their specific research, they're outside my field. But I think I can advise them on the research process. So that is a specific example, I agree.
Thank you. We have another question. I think a lot of the tips that you have spoken about now serve for being a successful venture capitalist. But what about people that want to work at startups? How do you improve the likelihood of picking one that will succeed?
Yep. So if you would like to work for a startup, make sure that these days it's so easy to find information about startups. Check who funded them, by the way. And if a startup is funded, if you would like to join a startup that already raised some money and it's funded by low quality investors, well, the truth is it has lower chance of succeeding. If it's being funded by investors more than 24 months ago, it has not yet raised another round of funding and it's not yet profitable, it has a much lower chance of succeeding. That's the result of my research. So be particularly careful about joining those startups, okay? That they are right now in the escalation of commitment phase, most likely. Another point that may be less important actually unimportant really for angels, but if you would like to become an employee of a startup, make sure that you talk to other employees. So people who are going to hire you are going to make due diligence on you. They will make reference calls on you. I'm actually getting a lot of calls about my former students from venture capitalists, but also from employers. Well, you should make a reference calls too. I find it really amazing when people getting hired in any company and they actually, they fight hard to get hired, get employed, getting an offer, and then they don't do reference calls themselves. So try to find out from employees, including those that left the company recently, about the culture of the place, about how decisions are made, and about how to become successful in the company. So the best question, in fact, this is not from me, this is from one of the favorite colleagues of the GSB, Professor Charles O'Reilly. He has this beautiful sentence. When you come into any organization, the right question to ask is, what should I do to become successful in this organization? Find this out, and then answer whether you actually would like to be in this organization. Maybe some things you have to do. Maybe this is something that you don't want to do. So I think that is the right way to do due diligence especially if you're getting hired into small startups, because in small startups, everything is driven by a couple of people, by the CEO, by a couple of co-founders, and the culture is much more structured in many ways. Because if you're getting hired into Microsoft, Microsoft has generic culture, but in fact, you're going to work in a specific department, and so that is different. So startups, I think, in fact, culture-wise, are much more easily defined and rigid because they're driven by specific personalities. So that behooves you to find it.
Thank everybody for joining us. And Ilya, thank you so much for taking time today to join us as well.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to seeing you again soon on campus or elsewhere around the world. Be venture-minded.